Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to today's special member event with Professor Camilla Townsend. I want to thank first Whitney Prendergast, our Director of Development, and Janine D'August, who is our membership coordinator, who've put together a terrific series of talks as part of our members program this year. Today, I'm honored to introduce Professor Townsend. But before we start, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor that Rutgers University is located on the ancestral lands of the still living, still sovereign Munsee Lenape people. We also honor the many and diverse Native American indigenous peoples who call this region home, past, present, and future. Our invitation to Professor Townsend was inspired by a new acquisition, and that painting will figure into today's discussion. As some of you know, we recently made a significant change in how we presented the Zimmerli's American Art Collection. For many years, we called the Krieger Gallery, the original Rutgers Art Gallery, the Gallery of American Art. In 2020, we decided to broaden our view of American art and think about the research done by the Scarlet and Black Project at Rutgers and dig into the history of our own collection. With the help of some talented graduate students in the Department of Art History and in History, we surveyed the American collection and found that we had indeed a number of artists who hailed from Central and South America, the Caribbean, and Canada. We also had a very few works of art by contemporary Native American artists. This gave us the opportunity to shift the focus of the gallery from one devoted to art of the United States to one devoted to arts of the Americas. We reinstalled the gallery with a judicious selection of work that had previously been in storage. We also purchased a few key works from living artists to bring attention to gaps in the historical record. A gift from Ada Rose Bitterbaum of a wonderful new painting by Maremi Andreozzi of Rebecca Rolfe, aka Pocahontas, now hangs in the gallery, and that painting is part of today's lecture. Let me introduce our speaker. Professor Townsend is Board of Governors Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University. She earned her PhD in history at Rutgers and has been a faculty member at the university since 2006. Before coming to Rutgers to teach, she was associate professor of history at Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. Dr. Townsend's work focuses on the history and culture of indigenous peoples and the relations between natives and newcomers throughout the Americas. She has authored numerous books, including Annals of Native America, How the Nahuas of Colonial Mexico Kept Their History Alive, and Pocahontas and the Powhatan Dilemma. Her 2020 book, Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, was awarded the prestigious Cundill History Prize by McGill University. She has been the recipient of many other prizes and fellowships, among them 2 National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Fellowships and a Guggenheim. Please join me in welcoming Professor Townsend. And I'm sorry, Professor Townsend, I forgot to say that this talk is being recorded and that we would appreciate that we save all our questions to the end. Please use your Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to send questions to us, and Janine will return to monitor those questions. Thank you, Professor Townsend.
Thank you, Donna. I want to thank actually the entire Zimmerli Museum, all the staff, and especially Donna Gustafson for inviting me and for arranging for today. I would also urge those of you who have not yet visited the newly revamped American Gallery to find a time to do that. I went a couple of weeks ago and was very moved. They have retained much of the old world, but brought in the new as well in a very beautiful and sort of mutually illuminating combination. So I hope we are, and I believe we are part of changing times in the art world. And it seems to me that Rutgers is doing itself proud in joining this sort of a new movement, a new wind, if you will, in the art world. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Are you all seeing now? I will assume that someone will signal to me if you are not seeing. see, these slides show that's titled The Life and Likenesses of Pocahontas. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Here is the painting, the brand new painting by Maremi Andreozzi, 2019, entitled Rebecca Rolfe, as Donna Gustafson just explained. Rebecca Rolfe, as you probably know, was the English name of Pocahontas. Okay? And I believe Maremi Andreozzi used that as the title of her painting with a tongue-in-cheek, so to speak, or to make certain points. Because, of course, she would know well that most of us know this woman as Pocahontas. Maremi Andreozzi is a contemporary Virginia artist. She painted this Rebecca Rolfe only in 2019. So we really are seeing a very current work of art. Okay? And this painting, in effect, became part of a new series that she is now embarked on that she calls History Adorned. Her idea, she says, is to look for ways in which women of the past, how does she put it, express their own visual language, and then combine what she finds them expressing with what she calls period cultural productions. Okay? So she's well aware that the women in question weren't entirely in charge of the visual presentation. So it's about the culture that surrounded them, as well as the women's own statements about their place in that culture. And the faces are always blackened. Okay? Again, this work, Rebecca Rolfe, was one of the first, but she has taken this idea that we cannot really see these women's faces, really know what they are thinking, okay? And run with it. I think this one is well worth thinking about, partly because it launched the series, but partly because it speaks on so many levels about history and about the questions in the art world that we've already alluded to today. The Pocahontas in this painting the original drawing was taken from life on a visit that the real Pocahontas made to London in the year 1616, 1617. Okay? And let's see, how do I want to put this? Okay, in some ways, okay, I think we can all agree, okay, the Pocahontas that is presented here was the one that was presented by her handlers. Right? We see a Pocahontas wearing a European-style top hat. Right? We see the great Elizabethan lace collar. Okay? We see probably European-style dangling earrings, pearl earrings. Okay? On the other hand, okay, we also see in the paintings traces of what might well be interpreted to be an indigenous influence. Okay? The hat has a feather in it that is sky blue, a color that is sacred to many different native tribes. Okay? The turquoise stone, or sort of a blue-green American jade, is sacred in many different parts of the continent, specifically because it evokes the colors of the heavens. Okay? We see the very elegance of the earring, the fact that it is a pearl earring, may be saying something to us in the sense that pearls were coming from the New World because Native American divers were bringing them up and bringing them to the attention of European merchant traders who brought them back. Okay? We see this person leaning forward, almost as if she wants to say something, and rising out of what could be considered a sort of a trapping lace collar, but what could also be considered a very elegant and impressive sort of stage set for her and for what she might want to say. So there are different ways to read this painting or what the painting evokes, including among them the idea that this woman wants to say something to us. Now, what might have given Maremi Andreozzi the idea to paint this painting in this style, in this way? Okay? There was, in fact, one drawing taken from life of Pocahontas during the time that she lived, okay? And here I give you a cutout just of the face, okay? That is found in an engraving that was made from that drawing. It's all we have to suggest what the real Pocahontas once looked like. Okay? Now, let me tell you a bit more about that drawing and that engraving. Okay? When Pocahontas was brought to London in 1616, and I will tell you more about that when we get to her real life. Okay? But when she was brought there, she was asked to sit for a drawing by a young Dutch-German artist named Simon van der Passe. They were both about 20 years old at the time, okay? So they were the age of our undergraduate students now, okay? Although perhaps a little bit more mature than some of our students are today at that age, okay? So he came to the hotel where Pocahontas and her English husband, John Rolfe, were staying, and he drew her. And in some ways, in this image as in the other, we can see that Pocahontas is being presented by her handlers. Okay? For instance, she is wearing the tall beaver hat that was then in vogue, including not only among men, but including among women if they were noble women. In fact, Queen Anne had recently sat for a portrait wearing just such a hat. Okay? She's wearing or holding a fan made of ostrich feathers, and that was a symbol of royalty. She's wearing very elegant textiles, I think you can see. I mean, not only the lace collar and embroidery, but probably embroidered with metallic thread, very elegant brocades. All of this designed to give the impression that life in Virginia, life in the new colony was going very well, and that the Virginia Company was very successful. Okay? On the other hand, other elements of the portrait come to mind if you dig a little deeper. Art historians have pointed out that when you look at women who were painted in such hats at the time, they never wore them inside, unless they were bourgeoises, that is, only queens and noble women would be painted like this in this hat. If the person is wearing a hat and they're inside, as this woman appears to be, then they are bourgeois. Then we're not, evoking royalty. On the contrary, we're evoking good, upstanding, upper middle class, Christian types, which were the very types, of course, who were the backers, the backbone, if you will, of the Virginia Company. Okay? You also see the fact that she's completely covered up. If they were really trying to evoke nobility or queen-like images, there would have been some shoulders showing, to put it mildly. Okay, this woman is dressed very much the way, again, a sort of haute bourgeois, successful Christian backer of the Virginia Company would want his wife to appear. Okay? So again, we see in this angle as well, a woman who is being presented the way the men around her, the white men around her, want her to appear. Okay? Given that, one might ask the question, is Maremi Andreozzi then, as an artist, as a cultural critic, one could argue, completely wrong in the argument that she is subtly making through her art, that there is room in the visual presentation that Pocahontas offered, okay, is that there is room there to see something of her, something of her own agency, something of her own desires. Okay? Well, I don't think she is entirely wrong, despite the fact that this engraving does sort of show the handiwork of her handlers. And I will make this argument in two ways. First, I will show you sort of the history, if you will, of very briefly, of images of Pocahontas. In a sense, in what sense, in what visual language, in the context of what visual language was Maremi Andreozzi placing her piece of art. And then secondly, I will walk you through the real life of Pocahontas, bringing you right up to the moment when this portrait was painted, and then show you a couple of things that are found in the portrait that I think do indicate that she was trying to make a statement to people then, and perhaps even to posterity. Okay, so first, the images that Maremi Andreozzi would have had in mind. I'm sure you all know that there is a whole world of sort of silly, almost ridiculous images of Pocahontas that have existed since the early 19th century. And that's putting it pleasantly. That's putting a positive spin on it. One could equally well argue that they are dehumanizing and objectifying. They certainly, what we can all agree on is that they have nothing to do with the real Pocahontas. Okay? Here you have a mid-19th century advertisement for a new magazine. And you see a Pocahontas who has curly hair. I guess it looks a bit Middle Eastern. You have behind her some teepees that were very typical of the Great Plains. You see some mountains. I don't know, the Rocky Mountains maybe behind her, nothing like the hills of Virginia, okay? And you see her herself wearing clothing that had nothing to do with the clothing that her people, the Powhatan Indians of Virginia, would have worn. Okay? And she is, of course, doing the usual, her half-naked, beautiful self is interposing between the threat from her father and the beloved John Smith, okay? And there are hundreds of these. I could go on forever, I promise you I won't. Here's an early 20th century advertisement for tobacco, also quite dehumanizing. Of course, the naked breast, and hey, you know, the sexually available girl wearing something more akin to a miniskirt than anything Pocahontas would have worn, and the headdress that someone like Sitting Bull of the Lakota might have worn 150 years later. Okay. Even very well-intentioned artists, I would argue, like those who made the Disney movie in the 1990s, who tried to, and I believe in many ways did, restore dignity to the character of Pocahontas, made no effort whatsoever to evoke anything like the real life of the woman who once lived, or to evoke her appearance. Okay. On the other hand, as Andreozzi well knew, there is a whole history, a long history of artists, serious artists, attempting to make something of the visage of Pocahontas, often using or reflecting on the Vanderpas drawing and engraving that still exists. Okay. This one is called the Boonton Hall painting. It's mid-18th century, and it is now part of the collection of the National Portrait Gallery in DC. And at first glance, one might think, well, it's a rather harmless, colorful evocation of this, taken from life image. But if you look a little closer, I think you will agree what we really are seeing here is a white woman, a 19th century, rather elite white woman. I'm sorry, an 18th century, rather elite white woman, not a face that brings to mind Pocahontas in any way, not literally and not figuratively. In response to numerous such paintings that existed, another Virginia artist 25 years ago, named Mary Ellen Howe, decided to try to bring the Vanderpas image into the modern multicultural world. It was 1994 when she painted this, and she called this work just Pocahontas, none of the subtlety of the name given to her painting by Andreozzi. I spoke to her about 20 years ago, and it was very interesting. She was most proud, I think it's fair to say, of the research she had done into the clothing, the sort of the visual culture accoutrements. She had found, for instance, that although we may think all top hats are black, many of the beaver hats were in fact bleached to a very fine white, that the feathers were likely to be white, that gold thread and gold brocade were very much in fashion, etc. Okay. So she was really, I think it's fair to say, interested in two things: painting a Pocahontas who appeared to be what she was, a beautiful Native American woman, not a white woman. And she was also very interested in trying to evoke the real historical context in a visual culture sense. I don't think she had any of Maremi Andreozzi's 21st century sense that she might want to introduce a bit more of a message than that. Okay. So we return to Andreozzi's painting. Again, you can see now very clearly, I imagine, the extent to which it both harkens back to these other works and also, well, I was going to say rejects them. That is perhaps not quite fair. but also critiques them, also insists on another truth, okay? That this woman is not someone we can know very well, that this woman has agency, has something to say. Okay? Before we sort of fully decide what we make of that, I would like to walk you through the story of the real woman, okay? Perhaps what you need to know most as an introduction, okay, is that there was a long history of Europeans attempting to use indigenous peoples, especially young ones, adolescent ones, as intermediaries. Okay? This is an 18th century print about an event that had supposedly taken place, well, to some extent did take place years ago in the 1560s. Okay? There was, when the Spaniards were exploring the coast of the Americas in the 1560s, there was an incident in which they kidnapped a couple of young boys from the Chesapeake and brought them to Spain and then to Cuba and then to Mexico, and then deposited them eventually back in Virginia without leaving any soldiers with them, just some Jesuits, because the boys, the young men by then, had promised to serve as intermediaries and help the Jesuits set up a new mission. Okay? Instead, the indigenous men warned their people of what was coming and brought a war party to kill all the Jesuits. And in so doing, they probably bought themselves another generation of peace and quiet because the Spaniards did decide that that part of the countryside, that part of the continent was not worth settling. In any event, this image, as you can see, became deeply emblazoned in the European consciousness. And they seem to have learned a number of things, and not that intermediaries were a bad idea, but that masculine ones were. That you didn't want to try to take a young man from a warrior culture who had been trained to fight and die for his people if necessary and expect him to become an intermediary. On the contrary, it was better to find, so ran the argument, and they weren't entirely wrong, better to find, to take by force if necessary, young women who worked out much better because they were often trained to be survivors, in fact, to be intermediaries, in fact, to intermarry with the enemy in order to make peace and prevent war. That was part of many different tribal cultures. And so the Europeans picked up on this. Okay? And one could say, enter Pocahontas right at this moment, just about the time that the Europeans, especially the English, had decided that they wanted their intermediaries to be young and female. Okay, so I am going to run us through sort of quick biography of Pocahontas before drawing some conclusions about the painting that you can reject or not as you see fit. Okay? So Pocahontas, the real Pocahontas, was born in the mid to late 1590s, the daughter of the paramount chief of the Powhatan Indians. That was a conglomeration of about 30 different tribes in Virginia. And her mother was one of his more insignificant wives. Powhatan was all-powerful. You know, he was a high chief, a high king. Okay? But the society was matrilineal, meaning that although men ruled, power passed through the female line. You can see that in the slide here, how it works. The high chief would be succeeded not by his son, but by his younger brother or his sister's son. Okay? So the fact that Pocahontas's mother was not noble meant that the girl herself was in fact politically insignificant, even though her father was the high chief of 30 tribes. Okay? Contrary to popular myth, Powhatan never referred to Pocahontas as his favorite. In fact, he is explicitly recorded as saying that another daughter was the dearest to him because she was the daughter of a much more important mother. The child who has become so famous to us was named Amonute at her birth, and later her sort of childhood personality earned her the new name of Pocahontas, which meant kind of little mischief. Right? So that is what they were calling her. Okay? When, in the spring of 1607, reports came to her father that there were 3 ships in the Chesapeake and that the men on board seemed to be looking for a water supply and a place to make camp. European ships had been running along the coast for decades, but the outsiders had never chosen to stay in the area, with the one exception, as you know, of the Jesuit settlement a bit further south. Okay. Stopping by, trading was one thing, but staying was quite another. So nerves were taut as the people tried to decide how to handle the situation. With Powhatan's permission or without it, we will not ever know, the tribes of the lower James River banded together while half the colonists were out one day and attacked those remaining at the little camp. So the men on shipboard used their cannons to spray the attackers with grape shot and force them to retreat. Grape shot, for those who aren't military buffs, are bits of metal that can be stuffed into a cannon or a falconet and used to sort of spray wounds and cuts among dozens of people. Okay. After that, the English lost no time in building a fort. Okay. The colonists sickened and died that first summer, as I'm sure you have all heard. So many fell at once that they couldn't even bury the dead in a timely way, much less search for food. That fall, after the illness had run its course, they drew lots, and it fell to one of the leaders, John Smith, to go up the Chickahominy River and attempt to extract corn from the Indians through trade. Here you have an image of John Smith, actually also drawn by Simon van der Passe later on. Okay. John Smith went up the river successfully several times, but on his fourth trip, a kinsman of Powhatan's captured him. Smith was paraded through several villages and eventually in December was brought before the high chief. Now, in grade school, you probably learned that he would then have had his brains dashed out, right? But for the efforts of his pretty daughter, Pocahontas, who was supposed to have thrown herself over him, right? Smith told that story one time, very briefly, after all the key players were dead and could not argue with him. He never said anything of the kind in a report he sent back to London immediately after his capture and eventual release. In fact, Pocahontas was only about 10 years old at this time. And even if she had entertained some weird passion for this 30-year-old Englishman, she was hardly old enough to control her father's diplomatic decisions. Smith did not die simply because Powhatan never had any intention of killing him. He pumped him for information, attempted to establish some sort of an alliance, and then had him escorted back to his camp. Now, it is true, as we might expect, that while Smith was captive among the Indians, Pocahontas did play the role of culture broker. She sat with Smith and they taught or attempted to teach each other bits of their language. Smith later wrote some samples in his journal, right? Kikaten Pocahontas patiakat ningtanks manyotens nermochik roranek ando. I should explain that the Powhatan language is now dead, but other cousins of that language, other Algonquian languages, as they are called, do still exist, most notably Abenaki. The meaning, as you see, is bid Pocahontas bring hither 2 little baskets, and I will give her white beads to make her a chain. Okay. So months later, it was Pocahontas whom Powhatan sent to the fort, along with one of his advisors, in an effort to negotiate the release of some Indians who had been captured in a skirmish. They were always skirmishing, those settlers and the Indians. Pocahontas was of an age to learn languages rapidly, and she had clearly already made significant progress. So this is most likely why her father thought she could be useful as a mediator. I do have to add, though, that it was very typical for Virginia chiefs to send their young daughters as intermediaries on dicey diplomatic missions, because it was a cultural understanding that you don't kill these girls, you allow them to be the intermediary that they can be so well. Okay. Anyway, the English did get their hostages back, and after that positive experience, Pocahontas was welcome and went back to see the colonists on a variety of occasions. She often did really bring gifts of food and generally solidified her people's relationship with the English. Okay. Now, Smith returned to England the next year, and sometime soon after, when she reached puberty, Pocahontas married an indigenous man named Kocoum. Now, by then, her own name among her people was Matoka, her adult name. And I've done some linguistic analysis, and it probably means one who kindles, one who is alit. But there's no absolute proof of that. Okay. She drops out of sight during the years of her marriage. Her people, however, began to fight off the encroachments of the colonists more and more determinedly, and the English became ever more violent in response. Eventually, in 1613, in a concerted effort to kidnap the children of chiefs so that they could serve as intermediaries, the English managed to capture her when she was visiting the Potomac on the now called Potomac River. The English were looking for someone who could be a translator, and from their point of view, the 15-year-old girl was simply perfect. They knew her, and she knew something of them and their language. Okay. Now, you may wonder if the Europeans had learned that they needed their intermediaries to be not only female, but also willing, why they thought it was a good idea to imprison one of them. Okay? But the English colonists were ahead of us in that regard. They were very kind to her by their lights, okay? And they made every effort to convince her that they loved her better than her own father did. And in fact, one chronicler actually put those words in her mouth, said that she said, "You seem to love me better than my own father does." I doubt she ever said that. Okay? They boarded her in the earnest religious community that had sprung up in the newly settled town of Henrico, surrounding a young devout minister who had settled in Virginia. Okay? They did that because there were several other women settlers in that little town. Okay? That really a fortified settlement. Okay? They fed her very well. They gave her English lessons, and they ostentatiously prayed for her soul, as you can well imagine. But a year went by, and though she did charm her captors with her personality and impress them with her talents, several said that, she did not choose to convert. Okay. So finally, the English decided to get some use out of her. Okay. If she wouldn't be a culture broker, she could at least serve as an effective hostage. Okay. They put her on board a warship and took her upriver amidst heavy fighting against her own people. Okay. Why is this happening? Sorry, folks. There we go. Okay. They thought that if they had a figurative knife to her throat, or perhaps an actual one, okay, on a boat only a stone's throw away from her father's settlement, okay, that her father would give them good terms for a peace. What they really wanted was regular tribute, payments in corn. Okay. But suddenly something unexpected happened. One of the colonists, John Rolfe, okay, wrote a letter to the governor, Thomas Dale, who was leading the troops himself, and asked his permission to marry the girl. In a part of the letter that is expunged from the version that is most generally reproduced in books today, he acknowledged that it was going to be a problem for his children to have a pagan mother. She had not converted yet. But he promised that his sons and daughters would be raised Christian, and said he would keep trying to convert Pocahontas himself. And as you can see here in a quotation from the letter, okay, he's saying even Calvin says that this is okay. Okay. We can count on the children being Christians, even if only one parent is among the faithful. Okay. He was not, he insisted, doing this merely to satisfy his lust. He refers to carnal appetites, but because he loved her and believed it would tend toward the greater good of the colony. The governor sent a messenger to ask Powhatan what he thought, and Powhatan, seeing in the arrangement a great deal of good, as I said before, it is what his people did often to make peace, okay, said, yes, it was a good idea. The following week, all of a sudden, Pocahontas converted. Okay. One cannot help wondering, I would argue, if she didn't do it to seal the political deal. If her mind was like that of most Indigenous people at contact, and it almost certainly was, right? Then she saw no harm in adding Jesus to the pantheon of gods she worshipped. Did not mean that she abandoned her old deities who had given her so many gifts, but rather that she promised to venerate in addition the God of her husband. Whatever she was thinking, she became a Christian, took the baptismal name of Rebecca, and willingly married John Rolfe a few days later. Now, of course, it was the young minister, Alexander Whitaker, who chose this name. You probably recall, Rebecca had two sons, Esau and Jacob, and Esau was red, and literally called red and subservient to the brother. So that is almost certainly what Whitaker, the minister, had in mind. Okay? But if you read the whole story in the Bible, I can't help thinking that it's very evocative of sort of a Hollywood-like drama. And as you can see, 19th century artists thought so too. Okay? She gets down from her camel to fill a water jar, and her eyes, meet those of her husband-to-be, and she feels something. It's a story that could well have called to the imagination of Pocahontas or Matoka herself. For a while, the peace engendered by Pocahontas's marriage held. The colonists left the fortified areas to plant crops, including tobacco, as you see here, and the Indians did not harass them anymore, believing as they did that the settlers would not make further encroachments now that they were in-laws to the high chief Powhatan. Pocahontas, meanwhile, was said by those who saw her to have been happy. She did not live in isolation from her people. That's probably important. For several of them came to work at Rolfe's farm or in his household. Rolfe said he was himself very happy, almost blissful, but he sighed that the Indians had known, that he had known, quote, do run headlong, yea, with joy, into destruction and perpetual damnation. So either Pocahontas was not always doing what he asked, or she was refusing to intercede with others. Some paganism was still happening, okay? She undoubtedly considered that it was enough that she had brought the two sides together and allowed them to make peace. In Native tradition, being a mediator entailed only that. You did not have to give up your inner self or ask anybody else to. Okay? So the long struggling Virginia Company saw a golden opportunity. And in 1616, they invited the Lady Rebecca, as they called her, to come to London at their expense to advertise for the venture. She and her new little son, Thomas, were living proof that relations with the Indians were now amicable and that it was safe to emigrate to Virginia or invest one's money there. Okay. They went. Pocahontas acted as an ambassador of sorts, generally increasing people's confidence in the company. And significantly, her people got something out of the deal as well. Okay. For she did not go alone, but was accompanied by several family members and at least one high-level advisor to her father. The English said his name was Udamaramakan, and I have again done some etymological research, and that name means, embedded within it, high priest to a chief, to a king. Okay? They clearly constituted, these people who accompanied her, clearly constituted a fact-finding mission of sorts, not simply the honeymoon party of a giddy girl, which is the way it's presented and often in typical histories. Later, after Udamaramakan's return home, he traveled through Indian country, warning his people that the English constituted more of a threat than had been known. His information may have been a crucial factor in the decision a few years later in 1622 to attack the English up and down the James River. I am almost certain that his information was crucial, but the evidence is circumstantial. But that would be much later. In the meantime, as many of you probably know, Pocahontas grew seriously ill and died at Gravesend in the spring of 1617, just as she was about to sail home. Okay. So here we go again with the slide problem. There we go. In one sense, sorry, gang. Here we go. In one sense, Pocahontas' story is a classic example of the risks and rewards of being a Native woman at contact. A relatively unimportant daughter in Powhatan's household through her position as mediator, rose to become the most important Indian woman in the region. As a young girl, it would have been her duty to babysit, really, her father's more important children. But among the English, she was a princess or the Lady Rebecca. They called her her father's favorite. They listened to her. And so did her father's people, for she had the ear of the English. And through her, a peace was forged for a while. On the other hand, it was never easy for her. John Smith was later accused by other Englishmen of making lascivious overtures to her when she was a child, and he admitted that he had in writing. Okay? As an adolescent, she was kidnapped by a rough sea captain and brought to the fort a prisoner with no idea what was to be her fate. She was held away from her people and all that was familiar for a year, and then brought up the river as a hostage in the middle of a battle. After her marriage, she was apparently chastised by her English husband for her behavior that he could not understand. And then before she could even turn 21, she died of one of the diseases prevalent in Europe that were soon to decimate her people. And those are only the elements that are easy to see. I would argue that there were even greater hidden strains experienced by the women who served as go-betweens. And I am partly talking about sexual violence, but I'm not only alluding to that. I am also alluding to the fact that they, in coming to know the European men or the European people better and more closely than their peers at an earlier stage, they would have come face to face with the sort of daunting realities that their people were facing far sooner than most did, and would have had to wrestle, did have to wrestle with the painful realizations that followed. Okay? Very often, if you look closely at the fragmentary sources that remain to us, you can find evidence that some of these young women were trying to make a statement, trying to talk back at least a little bit, sometimes quite strongly. So I have had that question in my mind. Did Pocahontas attempt to make any such statements? Okay? As I look at the bits of evidence that we have that stem from her life. And one of the best bits of evidence is, in fact, the Vanderpass engraving. Okay? Her efforts on behalf of her people, her efforts to respond to what she had learned, to defend them from the future, are barely audible to us today. But I think we can make out some traces. In the hotel room in London, she and her husband were put to work advertising for the Virginia Company in different ways. John Rolfe was asked to write a tract about the beauties and potential wealth of Virginia. He did so, but in the midst of it, he suddenly expressed a view that no other Englishman had yet expressed, and in which I can't help suspecting we are seeing or hearing the influence of his young wife. He suddenly insisted that the answer to the Indian problem was that the colonists had to learn to let the Indians decide which of their lands they were willing to part from, and then they had to be paid, and paid well, for any territory that they gave up. Literally, while he wrote those words, Pocahontas was sitting for her portrait in the other room. Okay? Beneath the picture, words appeared which no Englishman would ever have chosen. Matoaka, alias Rebecca, daughter of the mighty Prince Powhatan, emperor of, and there's sort of an unpronounceable word, okay, but it is in effect Tsanokomoko. Daughter of the mighty Prince Powhatan, emperor of Tsanokomoko. And then continues, alias Virginia, converted and baptized in the Christian faith and wife to the worthy Mr. John Rolfe. Okay. Now, the name of the territory that encompassed the four rivers between the James and the Potomac that constituted the kingdom ruled or controlled, dominated by her father, high chief of the Powhatans, was called in their own language Tsenokomoko, often represented as Tsenokomo, and that might actually have been represent a different grammatical placement within sentences. Okay? This word was represented in a variety of ways by English people who, as you can imagine, had a lot of trouble with it. They really did not like the initial consonant ats, and often represented it, as you see in the green word here in the midst of the quotation, with ATT. Okay? I am literally certain that what they meant by Atanokomotsko there above, okay, is what an indigenous person would have attempted to represent more along the lines of Tsanokomo. Okay? What I am 90% certain of is that only Pocahontas, or as she was then called, the Lady Rebecca, could have insisted upon this. It was not a word that rolled off the tongues of the Englishmen. Except for John Rolfe, it's not a word really that I think any of them would have heard. If John Rolfe had heard it, he had no reason to insist on using it, attempting to spell it, attempting to confuse the English audience for this engraving or drawing, later to be engraving, that they were preparing. You want an advertisement to speak to the people, not confuse the people. So it makes sense, I believe, that it was Pocahontas herself who insisted that her father's kingdom be called by its rightful name. She is known in the historical record of that year to have made other comparable statements. When John Smith visited her in the hotel, expecting a warm welcome, she said in front of other English people, "You lied to us. You did lie unto my people." And then when a Christian charity spoke to, and in fact interviewed her and her husband, asking them to take more money, more contributions, with which they could work on converting more people, she said, her husband said, but it's clearly coming from her, "We can take the money if you envision it as a thank you gift for what we have already accomplished or might accomplish. We cannot take the money if you consider that it is in exchange for converting a certain number of people, because we can make no promises of that kind." Okay? It's not the sort of thing that an Englishman in his position would have wanted to say. It is exactly the sort of thing that an Indigenous intermediary would have said. Okay? So, okay. We return now in conclusion to the painting with which we started. Okay? Through, I think, the Van der Passe engraving that Maremi Andreozzi was looking at, through the historical record that exists in other regards, I think we do find evidence, do see evidence of Pocahontas herself attempting to exert, perhaps not control, perhaps that was impossible at that time, but some agency in the situation, attempting to control some part of the message that would be passed down to posterity. And I think perhaps several hundred more years had to go by before a modern artist like Angiosi was able to pick up on that and try to translate it, as it were, into a visual production that the rest of us could understand as a statement of that nature. I'm happy to take any questions and also happy to entertain any pushback. Some of you may think that I'm going a bit too far, or that Maremi Andreozzi is going a bit too far in some of what we are implying. I will now stop sharing my screen and return to the world of the rest of you. Good. Hello. I believe, Janine, you are going to field any questions or comments. Is that correct?
Yes, will do. Okay. You can't see me, correct?
I can.
You can. Okay.
All right.
Just having a bit of a technical issue.
Yes, I do understand. I had trouble forwarding slides in ways I never have. Right. Okay.
Never a dull moment.
Right.
But I wanted to definitely thank you again for that very insightful talk, and open the forum up. Please feel free to use that Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to try to see myself. There we go. Okay, excellent. While we are waiting for those Q&As to come in, Professor Townsend, I had a question. I know you had mentioned that Pocahontas was already married to someone, to a peer of hers. Would that have, so obviously that didn't affect her going to be an intermediary, correct?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's actually one of the issues that I cut so that we would come in within the time, but it's actually quite important, and I probably shouldn't have cut it. We don't have proof of what happened to her husband. His name was Kocoum. We get that from William Strachey, one of the chroniclers. And he was a high-level warrior, not a chief. We don't have proof, but I believe he must have died. There were certainly plenty of opportunities for him to die. He was a warrior. There was illness even then, although not in epidemic proportion. And the reason I say he must have died, I mean, they could have been divorced, but I guess what I really mean is not that he must have died, but that the marriage must have ended, probably through that, possibly through divorce. And I say that because the English, again, were very eager that this marriage with John Rolfe speak volumes in terms of reassuring, allaying the concerns of people in England. If she were being, forcibly ripped out of a marriage that she was invested in with children, et cetera, number one, she wouldn't have been a good walking advertisement. You can't make somebody light up rooms in London if they've got, a gun or a blunderbuss or a knife to their head. And likewise, the English in question were very devout. We tend to think it was only the New England Puritans, but very similar men were involved in the beginning in Virginia. And they were not the type who would have wanted a woman who was married to somebody else acting as their cultural intermediary, nor would they have been willing to bless the marriage to Rolfe. Also, we know from English records that several indigenous men came to the wedding. Her father, her uncles, no, not her father, two uncles, two of his brothers. Excuse me, I misspoke there. Okay. That would not have happened if she were being ripped from the arms of one of them who still wanted this marriage. Okay. So we have circumstantial evidence that that marriage was over, most likely through death, although divorce was possible within the culture. That's a terrific question, Janine, and I'm sorry that I cut that part.
Thanks. No, that's okay. I was very curious. So now some questions from our members are coming in, fast and furious, which is great. Can you tell us more about what happened to the son of Pocahontas?
Right. So Thomas Rolfe got sick with the same, probably pneumonia-like condition that she got sick with. They all got it. We know it was a lung ailment, not dysentery, and it was quite sudden, and it hit them very hard. Probably like our experience with COVID at first. They were a virgin population to this microbe. They were all very sick, and a number of them died, not just Pocahontas. The little boy was 2 years old when they were about to sail. He was very sick, and his nurse, his nanny, the indigenous woman they had brought along, was also sick. And the father, John Rolfe, later wrote that in view of this, he decided to leave him to be raised with his brother in England. That may confuse some people today. It doesn't confuse someone who knows the early 17th century well, though. No young man, or no man, I should say, at that time was going to feel that he could suddenly become Mr. Mom and raise this baby without the wife or the nanny or anybody else. It would have been unimaginable. Okay? And remember, it was a much more full-time job. There were no playpens, there were no daycare centers, there was nothing. Someone had to chase that 2-year-old all the time. So it makes sense that he was left. When he was 21, interestingly, he hot-footed it for the new world. So he must have felt profoundly different, felt nostalgia all through that childhood, because he lost no time. Okay? However, I must point out that when he was in Virginia, when he returned to Virginia, he really entered the white world. There's one record of him having gone to see his mother's people in the higher territory land in Virginia where they then lived. But he came back and he married a white woman and entered Virginia society. And in fact, in a later war in the 1640s between the settlers and the Indians, he had to fight and did fight with the whites. He killed plenty of Indians. So his life in a psychological sense was not easy unless he very successfully, and hopefully did very successfully in his early 20s, sort of completely throw his psychological lot in with the white settler population. Some of his children are thought to, or his daughter is thought to have had children. We have no final proof, but we believe she had children. And assuming that is true, there are literally thousands of descendants of Pocahontas in Virginia and elsewhere in this country today. The rest of the chain of descent is documented. The part that isn't is whether or not his daughter had the children that she is thought to have had, but almost certainly that is the case. Okay.
Wow. I'd like to call on Donna now. Another one of our members would like to know more about the artist, which I'm assuming is the artist of the painting that inspired us all to invite Professor Townsend with us here this morning.
So first of all, let me say, Professor Townsend, that was such a wonderful talk. I really have 100 questions, but I'll let the members first ask questions. But it was really wonderful to hear so much about painting, and you did a wonderful job of really digging into the iconography of the painting and thinking about, the presentation of self, but also the artist's presentation of Pocahontas. So it was terrific. Thank you. So Maremi Andreozzi is a young artist. She lives in Virginia. She shows at a small gallery, which is called the Ada Rose Gallery. I have not met her in person, but I got to know her work because she showed in an exhibition in Jersey City a couple of years ago. The Pocahontas painting is one of a series called History Adorned, and it focuses on historical women, and as Professor Townsend so beautifully pointed out, Maremi really spends a lot of time thinking about presentation, about style, about fashion, and really talks about the difficulty of getting to know an individual person through a portrait when in fact the portrait is a sort of presentation of self, which includes all of those things. So she has a wonderful website, and if anyone is interested, I think if you just Google her, you'll find her, or look for her through the Ada Rose Gallery, and you can get a lot of information about her. I should also say
there are more of her paintings at the Zimmerli, which I was thrilled to see. Yes.
Yes, we actually have 4 of her paintings at the Zimmerli. We have Pocahontas, we have Mumbet, and then we have 2 later 19th century historical women also in the gallery. So definitely come and see.
Yes. Professor Townsend, we have another question about what exactly brought you to this work. I guess about your background on researching Pocahontas and I'm sure, and how you came to your book as well.
So it was a circuitous path. It's interesting. When I was a graduate student at Rutgers many years ago, I actually studied comparative economic history between North America and Latin America. As I did that work, did the dissertation and wrote my first book, it became very clear to me that really the usual explanation that the English and the Spaniards did things differently was wrong and was certainly utterly inadequate. That a huge element of the explanation had to do with which indigenous people were there and whether they were fully sedentary and accustomed to paying taxes and living in one spot with an address, sort of, or whether they were fully mobile the way Pocahontas people were. I mean, they were farmers, but they were only part-time farmers. They were absolutely willing to withdraw to the woods when they needed to, and they did. So the English could not relate to them in the same way that the Spaniards related to the indigenous people that they were finding in Mexico. So I thought, for my next project, I really want to investigate those early relationships between the colonizers and the colonized, between the new arrivals and the indigenous people. And as I did that work, again, it was to be another comparative book, I decided the projects have to be separated, because people who are invested in Mexican or Latin American history and people who are invested in US history don't share the same assumptions at all. I mean, as you well know, the United States sort of national imagination has long been invested in Pocahontas as someone we could love and adore because she loved us, right? She revered the white settler culture. And since most of us, not all, but since the dominant culture identified with those white settlers, that seemed beautiful to us, right? On the contrary, in Latin America, the majority of the people identify either as mestizo or indigenous. They identified with the conquered. So they have loved to revile a very similar go-between, also a very brave, smart young woman named Malintzin. And they have just sort of loved to dislike her as much as we have loved to love Pocahontas. So I thought, I can't address these 2 audiences in one book about this generational moment, because I'm going to be constantly sort of negotiating in this war about something that's quite different, that is who we identify with and what we therefore assume about people in the past. So I broke the study into 2 and ended up writing one book about Malintzin and one about Pocahontas. This was very good because it then launched me into the study of indigenous languages, because both women's stories really involve the study of any words that I could find that were surviving. And this brought me to sort of deeper and deeper into the study of Nahuatl language sources, which survive en masse, unlike anything in the Algonquian languages, which are just fragments. So it was part of sort of a long intellectual drama, and it led to great things. I mean, I'm very proud of the Pocahontas book, but I would also say that one of its important roles was to show me how much more we can do in places where indigenous language sources exist. If this were talk about Malintzin, I wouldn't have to say we think, we hope, we imagine, not nearly as much anyway.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I feel like we could be here all day. There's lots and lots of questions, but I feel like that was a good spot to end on. So once again, Professor Townsend, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us. This was eye-opening to me, as I'm sure to many others as well. And I'd like to thank Donna as well for her continued help and guidance as we continue our virtual member events throughout the fall. And just to remind everyone, our next virtual member event is Wednesday, November 10th at 5:30, and that will be an exclusive look at Angela Davis Sees the Time with Donna and her co-curator Jerry Began, as well as the archivist Elizabeth Telston. So I hope that you can all join us for that as well. And once again, thank you so much, Professor Townsend. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you all. Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.